As the Second World War came to an end in 1945, victory was in sight for the Allied forces. But for those caught in the chaos of its final days, survival seemed a distant dream. In the last winter of the war, a group of German women prisoners found themselves caught between the crushing weight of history and the freezing, unforgiving elements. These women, some innocent, others accused of being complicit in the Nazi regime, had been captured by the Allies and were being transported across Europe under the harshest of conditions. While the soldiers marching toward victory knew their mission was almost complete, these women were left to suffer a fate that history has largely forgotten. Their journey became a story of human suffering, neglect, and abandonment during one of the coldest winters Europe had seen in decades. The phrase, "they'll leave us to freeze," is etched in the memories of those who survived, a haunting reminder of the brutality of war, even in its final stages. In the bitter months of 1945, German POWs, including thousands of women, were moved from one camp to another, sometimes under guard, sometimes with little protection from the weather. These women were told they were being relocated, sent to safety, but in truth, they were being abandoned. The war was drawing to a close, and while Allied soldiers were focused on finishing the job, the lives of these women seemed expendable. Many were left to perish in the brutal winter, stranded in the cold, unable to escape the merciless conditions they found themselves in. They were forgotten, ignored, and left behind in the snow. In early 1945, Germany was on the brink of collapse. The Allies had marched across Europe, pushing the German forces back to their homeland. With the war nearing its end, millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in the chaos. Among them were German women who had been caught up in the war's path. Many were wives of soldiers, mothers, workers, or civilians accused of aiding the enemy. Some had been imprisoned for their connection to the Nazi regime, while others had simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. For these women, the end of the war did not bring freedom. It brought more suffering. As the Allies advanced, the women were rounded up and sent to POW camps, where they were forced to endure the horrors of war's final moments. The conditions in these camps were brutal overcrowding. Malnutrition, disease, and a lack of proper shelter were commonplace. The women were treated with suspicion, their fates determined not by their actions, but by the chaos that surrounded them. Some were taken to temporary holding sites, while others were transported across Europe as part of a wider effort to clear the region of German forces. But the fate of these women was not a simple one. The war may have been over for the soldiers, but for the women, the nightmare was far from finished. As the Allied forces continued their push through Germany, many prisoners were forced to march in the snow, day after day, with no rest, no shelter, and no food. They were driven by the relentless march of history, their lives deemed unimportant in the grand scheme of things. The winter of 1945 was one of the harshest Europe had seen in years. The snow piled up, the temperatures plummeted, and the cold seeped into the bones of those who dared to venture outside. The women, many of them elderly, sick, or pregnant, were subjected to these conditions without mercy. They were marched through the frozen landscape, exhausted and hungry, with no idea where they were going or what awaited them at the end of their journey. The Allies, focused on the final stages of the war, often ignored the suffering of the prisoners they had captured. While soldiers were hurrying to move the prisoners, they were ill-prepared to deal with the harsh winter conditions. The focus was on victory, not on the lives of those caught in the crossfire. The prisoners were often left to their own devices, struggling to survive as best they could. As the days wore on, many of the women began to collapse from exhaustion. Their bodies, weakened by hunger, the cold, and the long days of marching, could not endure the brutal conditions. Some fell behind, too weak to continue, while others were simply left behind, abandoned in the snow. Their cries for help went unheard, lost in the blizzard that seemed to swallow them whole. The phrase, "they'll leave us to freeze," became a chilling expression of their fear. They knew that, in the end, they were expendable. The soldiers, overwhelmed by their own exhaustion, had little time or resources to care for these women. The war was over, and survival had become a matter of luck, not humanity. For many of these women, the end of the war meant nothing. They were still prisoners, still victims of a conflict that had taken everything from them. It's easy to forget the war affects everyone, even those who are not directly involved in the fighting. These women had no part in the decisions that led to the war. They were not soldiers, not leaders, not generals. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. But in the end, they were treated no differently than the soldiers on the front lines. They were prisoners, and they were left to suffer. As the war ended, many of these women were released from captivity. Some were sent back to their homes, while others were left to rebuild their lives from the rubble of a broken Germany. For some, the trauma of what they had endured stayed with them for the rest of their lives. For others, their stories were forgotten, lost in the flood of history that followed the war. The suffering of these women was overshadowed by the larger narratives of the war, the battles, the victories, the leaders. But the pain they experienced during those final days of the war was no less real. The forgotten story of these women serves as a stark reminder of the brutality of war and its lasting impact on everyone caught in its wake. We often hear about the soldiers, the politicians, and the famous leaders who shaped the course of history. But the stories of the ordinary people, those who were caught in the crossfire, are often left untold. The women who were abandoned in the snow in 1945 are just one example of the countless victims of war whose voices were never heard. These women, left to freeze in the snow, were not the only ones to suffer during the final days of the war. Many others, including civilians, prisoners, and soldiers, faced similar fates. But their story, their suffering, has largely been forgotten. As we look back on the history of World War II, it's important that we remember not only the well-known figures and events, but also the countless people who lived through the war's horrors, who suffered in silence, and whose stories have been lost to time. The suffering of the women in those final months of the war is a powerful reminder of the cost of conflict, of the human toll that war takes on everyone, even those who are not directly involved in the fighting. Their pain, their loss, and their resilience deserve to be remembered, not just as a footnote in history, but as a reminder of the true cost of war. The story of these women is a call to reflect on the human cost of conflict. It's easy to get caught up in the grand narratives of history, to focus on the victories, the battles, the strategies. But we must also remember the individuals, the men, women, and children whose lives were shattered by the war. Their stories, no matter how small, no matter how forgotten, are just as important as the history of the generals and the soldiers. We must never forget the forgotten victims, the ones who suffered in silence, whose stories were lost in the dust of history. The women who were left to freeze in the snow remind us of the true cost of war, not in terms of battles or victories, but in terms of the human suffering that lingers long after the fighting ends. They were victims of a war they didn't start, of a conflict that took everything from them, and yet they were not even given the dignity of being remembered. Their story may have been forgotten, but it should not be ignored. In remembering them, we honor not just their lives, but the countless others who have suffered in wars throughout history. The story of these women is a reminder of the fragility of life, of the unpredictability of fate, and of the importance of remembering the forgotten. As we move forward, let us carry their memory with us. Let us remember that every war has its victims. Every conflict leaves behind a trail of pain and suffering, and every history has its forgotten stories. The women left to freeze in 1945 may be a small part of history, but their story is no less important than the great battles and triumphs that are remembered. They are a part of our shared history, and their story must never be forgotten again.